I am the Epileptic Explorer, and tonight we will continue our reading in Painkiller, written by Barry Meier. There was a Netflix series, I had to double check, Netflix series out there on the same name that talks about the history of the opioid pandemic, the crisis, whichever way you want to call it, and it also gives you a brief look into what would happen if the biggest drug we have in this country, which is I'm trying to remember. I know I've said it before in my channel, and I'm pretty sure it'll come back to me. Anywho, I've been enjoying this book. Um, I found it very interesting, and I hope you all get to enjoy this. I hope you all get to enjoy this book. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and continue reading Painkiller. In 2018, an opioid pandemic that began 2 decades earlier with Oxycontin finally seized the nation's attention. Over 250,000 Americans had died from overdoses involving prescription painkillers. Every day, hospital emergency rooms nationwide treated 1,000 people for abusing or misusing these drugs. Prescriptions written by narcotic painkillers and overdoses associated with the drugs had started to slowly decline, but counterfeit versions of fentanyl, that's the name of it, were rapidly driving up the overall numbers of overdose deaths. President Donald J. Trump, pointing to the death toll, officially declared the opioid crisis a national emergency. In early 2018, he announced a plan that included increasing addiction treatment and reducing the medical use of opioids. In that same speech, Trump called for a tougher approach to drug dealers, including using the death penalty. It wasn't clear how his administration planned to fund its proposals to deal with the opioid crisis, but experts acknowledged that government officials had failed to stem an epidemic when they had the chance. We didn't get ahead of it. Nobody got ahead of it, said Dr. Scott Gottlieb, appointed by President Trump to head the FDA. Journalists also sought to give the opioid crisis a face, that of the Sackler family. In 2017, both Esquire magazine and The New Yorker magazine published lengthy accounts that depicted Raymond and Mortimer Sackler as corporate titans who made billions from Oxycontin's marketing and opened the door to the public health catastrophe that followed. The article's timing led the New York Times to undertake. Let's see here. Where was I at? Da, 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 to undertake a survey of 21 museums and institutions worldwide that had received funds from the Sacklers or family run foundations to learn if any of them would return the money given its connection to the notorious painkiller. None of them planned to do so. It was also in 2017 that Raymond Sackler, the last remaining Sackler brother, died at the age of 97. Faced with a new burst of attention, Raymond and Mortimer's adult children, who had once worked at Purdue, stood behind the family's traditional wall of silence. However, Arthur Sackler's daughter, Elizabeth, an art historian and trustee of the Brooklyn Museum in New York, was eager to put space between the money she had inherited from her father's promotion of drugs, such as Valium, and the fortunes that her uncles and their families had reaped from Oxycontin. In a statement issued to a reporter writing about museums and Sackler money, she pointed out that her uncles had persuaded her father's share of Purdue Frederick following his death in 1987. A decade before Oxycontin was launched, by 2017, sales of Oxycontin had exceeded $31 billion. But her wing of the Sackler family had never made a dime from the drug. The opioid epidemic is a national crisis, and Purdue Pharma's role in it is morally abhorrent to me, she said. Though the federal prosecutor Randy Ramsayer predicted that the Purdue executives' guilty pleas would affect would affect the behavior of other companies' officials, that was not the case. Between 2007 and 2012, the three biggest wholesalers of prescription drugs in the United States, McKesson, Cardinal, and AmerisourceBergen, shipped 780 million pain pills containing oxycodone and hydrocodone to West Virginia, a state already rife with opioid addiction. A newspaper what there reported the volume represented a quantity large enough to supply every man, woman, and child in the state of West Virginia with 433 pills. Over that same 5 year period, more than 1,700 people in West Virginia died from fatal doses involving prescription opioids. Meanwhile, as the opioid epidemic intensified, drug industry lobbyists succeeded in 2016 in getting a law passed that made it harder for the DEA to block shipments of pain pills going to doctors or pharmacies suspected as illegal outlets for opioids, according to a report in the Washington Post. It is often said that prosecutors fall in love with their cases, and it is not usual for supervisors to modify or reject their recommendations. But the Justice Department, in choosing not to charge Purdue's executives with felonies, left unanswered the most critical question in the government's case. When did Purdue first learn about OxyContin's abuse, and what did the company officials do about it? Michael Friedman, Howard Udell, and Paul Goldenheim would insist before and after their guilty pleas that they learned of the problem in early 2000. And years afterward, a Purdue spokesman, when asked about the prosecutor's recommendations for indictments, pointed to John Brownlee's 2007 Senate testimony, in which he described the strict liability charges against the men as appropriate. But government prosecutors and investigators involved in the Purdue inquiry saw it very differently. They believed they had uncovered Purdue's original sin, one so shocking and heart sickening that it trumped all the lies the company admitted telling. The Oxycontin disaster should have never happened. Prosecutors believed because Purdue knew by 1997, 3 years before the main alert, that its wonder drug was being abused, but said nothing to warn doctors, patients, and the public. Even as the conspirators marketed Oxycontin as less addictive, less abusable, and less divert- divertible than other opioids, as early as 1997, they began receiving reports from health care providers and the news media indicative of widespread abuse and diversion of Oxycontin. Prosecutors wrote in their 2006 memo. If prosecutors were right, it wouldn't have taken much for Purdue to have sounded an early alarm. Company officials could have shared what they were learning with regulators and lawmakers and decided together what actions were needed. Years later, Purdue would have been applauded for preventing a catastrophe rather than castigated for causing one. Years later, no one would have questioned the source of the Sacklers' wealth or whether prestigious museums should be taking the family's money. But being forthright also carried a price. If regulators at the FDA or lawmakers had learned early on about the drug's abuse, then Purdue risked losing its unique labeling claim, the one celebrated by company officials as its principal selling tool. Just as the massive marketing campaign for OxyContin was starting, absent absent that claim, doctors would have viewed OxyContin with the same caution uh, as any other narcotic, it would not have produced billions in profits. It could never have served as the vehicle to let Purdue, in Raymond Sackler's words, reach the moon. All the evidence prosecutors had unearthed to make their case was contained in the 2006 memo they sent to John Brownlee, and much of that evidence was reburied with top Justice Department officials rejected their recommendation for indictments. In their, in their memo, prosecutors detailed everything they believed of- officials of Purdue had learned about the early abuse of OxyContin and its predecessor, MS Cotton, and how company officials had allegedly painted a false picture while making statements in Congress and elsewhere. The memo stated, had the persecutors provided Congress and their sales representatives with the truth, that is that Purdue had been aware, at least as early 1997 to 1998, that both MS Cotton and OxyContin were subject to widespread abuse and diversion but continued to market OxyContin as less addictive, abusable, and subject to diversion in the face of this knowledge. The sales representatives would have lost all credibility with health care providers, and Purdue's conduct would likely have been subject to much greater regulatory and congressional scrutiny. The memo cited dozens of internal Purdue emails, records, and other documents in support of those claims, starting with the extent of the company's knowledge of MS Cotton's misuse. It had been far greater than the few scattered incidents that Purdue officials had claimed. Prosecutors believed, and the company knew it by 1996. Internal Internal Purdue emails showed that addicts had discovered how to defeat MS Cotton's time release formulation in order to extract morphine from a tablet so they could shoot it up. For example, in May of 1996, prosecutors found Richard Sackler and Howard Udell were, were sent a medical journal article about MS cotton abuse called Recovery of Morphine from a Controlled Release Preparation. And in August of that year, company records showed a Purdue scientist assigned to research MS Cotton abuse emailed his findings to Sackler, Udell, Michael Friedman, Paul Goldenheim, and other Sackler family members, including Raymond and Mortimer. I found MS Cotton mentioned a couple of times in the internet underground drug culture scene. That researcher wrote in his that researcher wrote in his email. Most of its Most of it was mentioned in the context of MS Cotton as a morphine source. He added he had also found an academic publication that mentioned MS Cotton as a source of morphine abuse in Australia. The following year, Paul Goldenheim received a copy of an article from an American medical publication that reported morphine is readily extracted from MS Cotton for street abuse. And in another 1997 email, a top Purdue medical officer, Robert Keiko, told company executives that MS Cotton was the most common source of morphine for drug addicts in New Zealand. That year, Purdue executives were deciding whether to ask German regulators to place less restrictive controls on sales of Oxycontin sales there. But Keiko pointed out in his email that the company would find that argument hard to make because it didn't have data about product abuse. We do not have a post marketing abuse monitoring system and database from which we could conclude that diversion/abuse is not occurring, he wrote. By 1998, Purdue would get a better sense of that problem when the Canadian Medical Association Journal published its study and and an accompanying editorial warning that drug abusers would also seek out the company's latest releasing time release drug, OxyContin. In March of that year, Howard Udell wrote a legal memo entitled MS Cotton Abuse. which he sent to members of the Sackler family involved in Purdue's operations. In the memo, the Purdue lawyer described several articles in Canadian newspapers that had appeared at around the same time as the study in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. He highlighted a passage from one of them, the Ottawa Citizen, which stated that a prescription of 30 pain-killing morphine mescatin 60 mg tablets, known as purple peelers, costs $58 from a pharmacy but fetches $1,050 on the black market at $35 a tablet. He also noted in his memo that a virtually identical story had appeared on the front page of another Canadian newspaper, the Vancouver Sun. By then, Purdue officials also knew that Oxycontin was being abused. An email found by federal investigators indicated the email was written in the fall of 1997 by a senior Purdue marketing official, Mark Alfonso, and sent to Michael Friedman and other executives. In the memo, Alfonso reported that mentions of Oxycontin were appearing on websites and in chat rooms frequented by drug abusers. Monitoring the traffic, he wrote, was enough to keep a person busy all day. We have 3 people that visit the site chat rooms. In addition, we have started a project that will have one of our people visit the most popular chat rooms at least once a month. It was around that time prosecutors believed that Purdue officials, based on what they were learning about the abuse of Oxycontin and MS Cotton, should have called a timeout, but Purdue didn't do so, and it apparently showed no interest in telling doctors or even its own sales reps what it was learning about the vulnerability of its time-release drugs. Purdue apparently not only never alerted FDA officials about the Canadian Medical Association Journal study and its implications, but company sales reps kept giving out copies of the 1993 report by Dr. Daniel Brookhoff, which suggested that drug abusers had little interest in time-release medications like Oxycontin. During 1999, the year before the main warning, prosecutors found Purdue received a flood of information about Oxycontin abuse. That January, Howard Udell alerted a fellow company executive in an email that we have in fact picked up references to abuse of our opioid products on the internet. And that month, a Purdue sales rep in Ohio reported in a call note that all one doctor there wanted to talk about was the new street value of Oxycontin. By mid 1999, the tempo of reports coming into Purdue headquarters intensified. Prosecutors prosecutors found during a 2-week period in August 1999, for example, Purdue executives were sent reports that a doctor in Pennsylvania had stopped writing prescriptions for Oxycontin because his patients were altering them. The Connecticut man had been arrested for trying to illegally purchase Oxycontin. The Massachusetts man had told police that he preferred to crush the drug because it worked better if he sniffs it, and that a drugstore in Maryland had been robbed of Oxycontin by armed thieves. Purdue's top officials. Woo! Sorry, pretty girl. Sorry, pretty girl. Okay, sorry. Where was I? Had been robbed of Oxycontin by armed thieves. Purdue's top officials also learned then that a Florida nurse was about to publish an article identifying Oxycontin as a drug of abuse. Emails cited by federal investigations showed. That same month, William Gurgley, the only Purdue insider interviewed during the brief inquiry by Florida State Attorney General Bob Butterworth, told his superiors that one doctor in his territory who was a huge writer of Oxycontin had stopped prescribing all opioids after learning that some of his patients had been arrested for altering Oxycontin prescriptions. And it was also at about that this time that Purdue sales reps Kimberly Keith submitted her call notes about the Oxycontin's abuse in Lee County, Virginia, and that company officials became aware of the Oxycontin alert issued by Cambria County in the western part of Pennsylvania. In September, soon after Maureen Sarah sent Howard Udell her 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 email citing internet chat room discussions about Oxycontin abuse. Friedman, Udell, and Goldenheim received two similar emails from a Purdue employee reporting chat room discussions about snorting Oxycontin, according to records found by investigators. Still, Purdue did nothing, and many sales reps apparently never learned about the extent of the drug's abuse. In their report, prosecutors cited a November 1999 memo sent by Purdue district manager to reps in southwestern Virginia and West Virginia areas where abuse of Oxycontin was exploding, offering them tips about how to respond to concerns raised by doctors. In it, he advised, refer to studies involving over 20,000 patients that show less than 1% iatrogenic addiction when patients treated with opioids for pain. Doctor says they are crushing it and shooting it up. Say, how many of your patients come in with tracts on their arms? Doctor responds, none. Then what's the issue? If he has some, should refer to addiction addictionologist. Doctor says police arresting people sniffing crushed Oxycontin. Great! The police are doing their job. If the patients such abusers are reformulating it they are once they are out your door, it's not your responsibility. Just as that memo was going out, another newspaper, the Florida Times Union, published an article about the arrest of a doctor in Jacksonville, Florida, on charges of running a pill mill that sold Oxycontin and other drugs. In it, a local law enforcement officer described the physician as dealing prescription drugs to people, just like a crack cocaine dealer would be selling crack to people on the street. An email written by the Purdue sales rep in Jacksonville quickly found its way. Sorry, I just want to make sure. Okay. Quickly found its way to the top of company officials. Prosecutors reported, while many salespeople have sold controlled release opioids as having less abuse potential, the current the current situation has placed us in an awkward situation, the rep wrote. I feel we have a credibility problem with our product. David Haddocks, who had joined Purdue a few months earlier, also received the article from the Jacksonville paper. He apparently became concerned and he emailed company officials to suggest that Purdue implement a crisis response plan. Prosecutors found Michael Friedman replied that he didn't think such action was needed. I simply do not want us to overreact to this specific story, he wrote in an email. Physicians have been accused and arrested from time to time. As long as these drugs have been around, this is not a repetitive pattern or something new. The case of one bad apple passes with time. I am concerned with long term issues that influence the use of these drugs, not one doctor who is dishonest. Pros- Prosecutors saw more than a few bad apples. Over the course of 1999, other physicians, including Dr. James Graves, the physician from Pace, Florida, had been arrested on charges of illegally dispensing Oxycontin. Federal investigators also ran a search of call notes written by Purdue sales reps between 1997 and 1999 for the words street value, crush, and snort, and reported that one or more of the terms appeared in 117 call reports written by reps in 27 states. Prosecutors also believed that executives at Purdue were concerned that the company's knowledge about how widely its painkillers were being abused might leak out. In June of 2000, a few months after the main alert, Mark Alfonso sent Michael Friedman an email describing how the chaos involving Oxycontin reminded him of what he had observed earlier when he managed sales of MS Cotton in the Midwest. I recall that I received this kind of news on MS Cotton all the time and from everywhere, Alfonso wrote. Some pharmacies would not even stock MS Cotton for fear they would be robbed. In Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Oklahoma, we had physicians indicated for prescribing too much MS Cotton. Freeman, prosecutors stated, forwarded Alfonso's email to Howard Udell with a message asking if the lawyer wanted all this chat on email. A year later, Friedman, Udell, and Goldenheim uh, all all testified that they were aware of only a few scattered incidents of MS Contin abuse during the 17 years of company marketed that drug. Purdue also worried about the potential drug posed by call notes written by sales reps. Prosecutors asserted. So by 2001, company lawyers started training reps to avoid using words such as addiction and abuse in their notes. The scope of the profits that Purdue executives and the Sacklers derived from Oxycontin was extraordinary, prosecutors discovered. By 2002, 6 years after the drug appeared, its annual sales had reached $1.5 billion, or three times the revenue that MS Cotton sales had produced during a decade. Within Purdue, the awarding of salaries, bonuses, directors' fees, and other similar payments corresponded to the increase in OxyContin sales. Prosecutors reported they also found that in 2001 alone, companies controlled by Raymond Sackler and Mortimer Sackler or their families received $1 billion in profits. Those funds flowed into a thicket of Sackler owned business entities with names such as BR Holdings Associates, Beacon Company, and Rose Bay Medical Company, which were which were reminiscent of the paper corporate empires created by Arthur Sackler. Years later, in 2015, Forbes magazine welcomed the families of Raymond and Mortimer Sackler as the latest newcomers to its list of the wealthiest Americans, with a fortune estimated at $14 billion. Okay. According to the magazine, they had edged out storied families such as the Millans and Rockefellers in the magazine's rankings. How did the Sacklers build the 16th largest fortune in the country? Forbes asked. The short answer, making the most popular and controversial opioid of the 21st century, Oxycontin. The Sacklers might have fallen short of reaching that storied stature. However, if the Justice Department had gone to trial, had the prosecutor's evidence had erred, doctors would likely have become more weary of claims by Purdue and other opioid makers and reduced their wholesale dispensing of the drugs. Had the government insisted on a trial, lawmakers and regulators might have turned a deaf ear to arguments by drug industry lobbyists and their medical allies that succeeded in blocking reasonable controls on opioid use. Professional medical organizations, law enforcement associations, and groups representing pain patients might have learned that drug companies such as Purdue don't give their money away without expectations and broken their dependency on industry funds. If they needed evidence on such motives, these groups would have benefited from reviewing the transcript of a March 2001 telephone answering machine message contained in the prosecutor's memo. At the time, a newspaper had just published an article about a Medicaid investigation involving Oxycontin, in which Connecticut State Attorney General Richard Blumenthal expressed concerns about what he viewed as Purdue's overly aggressive marketing of the drug to doctors. The next morning, Purdue's chief spokesman, Robin Hogan, left a message on the phone of one of Blumenthal's assistants that made it clear that Purdue had money to reward friends and withheld it to punish enemies. I wanted to signal our very high level of disappointment in the way the whole press was handled around the AG's comments on this Medicaid fraud, Hogan said. I thought we had an understanding he was going to clarify and retract the statements last night. The doctor was wide open, and he did not do it. Purdue Pharma is a significant supporter of the Democratic Party. Very interesting. Pharma, let's see. It's very unfortunate that this had to happen to one of your major benefactors. I think there's an election coming up, and I can assure you this has not helped his cause in this camp. A few days later, a lawyer in Blumenthal's office sent copies of the tape and a certified transcript of Hogan's message to Raymond Sackler, Howard Udell, Michael Friedman, and Hogan. Both Udell and Hogan sent a subsequent letters of apology. As the opioid epidemic expanded, it was not only the Justice Department that failed to make desperately needed steps. Drug regulators, lawmakers, medical associations, and even public health officials seemed frozen, uncertain of what to do or how to respond. They also seemed unable or unwilling to stand up against the drug industry, even when those actions would have benefited patients. During the Obama administration, for example, White House officials proposed a rule suggested more than a decade earlier by Nathaniel Paul Katz that would have required mandatory training for doctors prescribing powerful opioids like Oxycontin. But lobbyists for the American Medical Association made it clear to administration officials that they would go to war over such a proposal, and the White House backed down. Drug makers paid little heed to the few rules that the FDA adopted to control the marketing of high-powered opioids. One small company, Insys Therapeutics, even borrowed pages from Purdue's playbook to drive sales of its product, a form of fentanyl called Subsys. While the FDA approved the drug's use only for cancer sufferers, Insys sales data soon showed that such patients represented only 1% of the Subsys prescriptions written by doctors. The drug's biggest prescribers, it turned out, were not cancer experts but regular physicians, including several who would be charged with running pill mills. As with early heavy prescribers of Oxycontin, some of those doctors also received tens of thousands of dollars in speaking fees from Insys. To spur sales, Insys adopted Purdue's bonus system, in which reps were rewarded based on the increase in the dollar value of prescriptions their base doctors wrote rather than an increase in the number of prescriptions. This created a system that paid the biggest bonuses to reps who promoted the strongest doses of Subsys. In 2010, Purdue began to sell a new form of Oxycontin, which the company said was more resistant to abuse. Art Van Zee had urged the company to take that step a decade earlier, but Purdue officials said it had taken them years to develop the required technology. It may have been a coincidence, but Purdue launched the product just as its patent on the original form of the painkiller was expiring. The company took a number of other steps to help curtail the opioid crisis, such as funding prescription monitoring programs and helping to distribute naloxone, the drug used to reverse overdoses. Also, Purdue said that in 2016, it ended its long use of paid speakers to promote Oxycontin. But Purdue found it increasingly difficult to distance itself from the havoc sowed by Oxycontin. In 2017, the United States Attorney's Office in Connecticut began a new investigation into the company in response to a 2016 article in the Los Angeles Times. The Times reported that the company's claim that Oxycontin's analgesic effect lasted 12 hours was misleading and that in many patients it wore off more quickly. If so, patients would have had to take more Oxycontin to get relief, and this would place themselves at greater risk for dependency or addiction. In response to the article, Purdue insisted that Oxycontin worked as claimed. Dozens of states, cities, towns, and tribes of Native Americans had also filed a wave of new lawsuits against Purdue and other opioid manufacturers. In each case, the drug companies were under attack for reckless and misleading promotion of drugs that caused taxpayers to spend untold billions on the healthcare costs related to drug abuse and addiction. Even the small Philadelphia suburb of Bensalem, where Michael Friedman first publicly testified to the extent of Purdue's knowledge of OxyContin's abuse, had sued the company. In early 2018, with sales of OxyContin declining and without new major drugs in development, Purdue announced a major retrenchment. It would no longer send out sales reps to doctors' offices to promote OxyContin and was cutting back its sales staff to 200 people. It its approximate size before OxyContin was launched. Purdue was still promoting the drug overseas, but the company's decision was an acknowledgement that its glory days were behind it. Some of those who had crossed swords with Purdue, like Terry Woodworth, the one-time DEA official, thought that moment should have come a decade earlier, when the federal government had Purdue on the ropes, but Justice Department officials balked when they had the opportunity and allowed the last, but best chance to slow the opioid epidemic to slip away. And that is the end of chapter 11. And since we have some time, we'll go ahead and read the epilogue because it's only a couple pages. So we'll go ahead and read that. Much has happened since the first publication of this book in 2000. Okay. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and read this epilogue because it talks about the publication of this book. So we'll go ahead and read that. Much has happened since the first publication of this book in 2003. But perhaps the biggest change involves a new understanding of the benefits and risks posed by powerful opioids such as Oxycontin. During the 1990s and 2000s, doctors were principally concerned about the threat such drugs posed for abuse and addiction. But over the past decade, a wealth of research has emerged to show that the long term use of opioids, even when taken as directed, carries an array of patient risks such as emotional dependency, reduced sexual drive, extreme lethargy, increased falls in the elderly, and even the development of an increased sensitivity to pain. Just as important, a number of recent medical studies have shown that pain patients often recover faster with fewer complications if provided with treatments other than opioids. As a result, the treat as a result, the treatment of pain is again undergoing a sea change. Hospital emergency rooms no longer routinely use opioids, and patients recovering from surgery are given over the counter pain relievers rather than powerful narcotics. Doctors have also turned away from using opioids for specific conditions, such as migraine headaches, and federal agencies are urging that opioids be employed only as a treatment of last resort. This turnabout began quietly in 2003 with a little noticed study in the New England Journal of Medicine. The report was written by Dr. Jane Ballantyne, who was then the head of pain treatment at one of this country's most prestigious hospitals, Massachusetts General in Boston. For years, Ballantyne had been a loyal soldier in the war on pain, but she began to notice phenomena that troubled her. While chronic pain patients on opioids did well initially, their health, as measured in outcomes such as pain relief or improved physical function, soon flattened out or even regressed. The response reminded Ballantyne of what she had observed in hospital patients on mechanical ventilators who were sedated with opioids. Over time, as patients required higher opioid doses, they became more, not less, sensitive to pain. Some patients writhed in agony as the touch of a bedsheet against their skin. Ballantyne believed such reactions were attributable to tolerance, the natural phenomenon associated with opioids in which the body adapts to a drug. Uh, sorry, adapts to a drug and requires higher doses to maintain the same level of pain relief. During the height of the war on pain, opioid, opioid advocates had insisted that tolerance was not a barrier to treating chronic pain, because doctors could increase dosages as high as needed, without ill effects, to overcome tolerance. But in her 2003 article, Valentine challenged this idea. By ramping up opioid doses, she warned, doctors ended up chasing pain and, in the process, risked harming patients. While it was previously thought that unlimited dosage escalation was at least safe, evidence now suggests that prolonged high-dose opioid therapy may be neither safe nor effective, she wrote. Opioid proponents marked Ballantine as a traitor, but subsequent research would support her warning as prescient. prescient. Researchers in Denmark, a country that keeps detailed records on how patients respond to differing medical treatments, found that pain patients put on non drug treatments recovered at a rate 4 times faster than patients given opioids. Researchers with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs would report similar findings. The damage inflicted on patients by the unbridled use of opioids became apparent in other ways. Studies have found that workers who were given high dosages of opioids to treat common injuries such as back pain were out of work 3 times longer than those who were put on a lower dosage, and some of them never returned to their jobs. Even insurers who had helped stoke the opioid boom by refusing to pay for other kinds of pain treatment began to have sound thoughts, though these were likely attributable to financial concerns rather than worries about patient welfare. It turns out that the opioid driven approach to pain was costing them far more than they imagined in terms of both patient care and addiction treatment. In recent years, pain specialists who championed high dose opioid use have offered explanations for the failings of the war on pain, or have tried to rewrite their roles in it. But their enthusiastic advocacy has produced a terrible legacy, a generation of narcoticized patients who find it nearly impossible to give up their dependency on opioids and seek other methods of treatment. Addiction is not the real problem, one of those advocates, Dr. Scott Fishman, said. What we didn't realize is that patients would use these drugs to opt out of life. The opioid crisis is actually two separate crises, each with its own causes and solutions. One involves illegal narcotics, such as a counterfeit fentanyl, and requires the attention of law enforcement as well as compassionate treatment for those addicted to these lethal drugs. The other crisis lies in the medical use of opioids, and its solution is much easier. Doctors need to use fewer opioids and turn to other ways of treating pain. As for the Sacklers, they were now pariahs, the family's name stripped from the walls of museums and medical schools. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy protection, and by 2021, the descendants of Mortimer and Raymond Sackler were offering to pay some $6 billion to buy protection for themselves from future lawsuits. The Sacklers continued to insist that they had done nothing wrong and that critics were unfairly vilifying them. Still, during the years when they were making billions from Oxycontin, the family apparently never sought to separate profits generated by legitimate prescriptions from those coming from prescriptions that ended up on the street. It's possible that secret Purdue Pharma documents may emerge one day to show that the Sacklers really did try to sort out good money from bad. But if so, it's hard to understand why the family and their lawyers haven't publicized them. The simple truth, it appears, is that all that money went into the same pot. That's how the Oxycontin story began, and that is why it ended. I hope you all enjoyed this book. Um, if you are have been following this book and want to read similar or other books like this, or you have an idea of what book I should read next after this, please comment down below, and I will see of making future plans for that book. Um, so the next book on our list that we're going to continue reading again is going to be it'll be on Sundays again. We'll be doing Sunday specials again because it's been a little bit and it's been kind of a difficult transitioning with schedules, but now we're back on track, and I hope we get to continue this. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this book. Please like and comment down below, and please hit the bell icon for more videos so that way you don't miss the next book that comes out. So I hope you all enjoyed this, and we'll see you all in the next video. Um, if if you are now, I'm gonna say this before I end it. If you are one of those that are trying to find information about how to stop or encourage someone to stop with drugs, or how something like drugs would cause an issue, this is a great book to have. I highly recommend it. This was a really good book, lots of information, really well written. I would highly recommend it for you to read and get to know what the opioid epidemic was like and what um, fentanyl could do if it ended up being a crisis with fentanyl, an opioid crisis with fentanyl instead of Oxycontin. If you are on, if you're addicted, and if you're on drugs and you're stuck and you feel like you don't know where to go, please, I encourage you to find someone that you can trust. I encourage you to find a pastor, find a counsel group, um, go go to group therapy, find some people that you can trust about your addiction and how you and them and how you guys can keep each other accountable and each other keep each other on track with how you guys are going, how you guys are doing. So I hope you all enjoyed this book, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Until then, this is the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.